I'll start at the beginning. I met him at Lisa's work. It was a fancy evening, and everyone was dressed to impress. Lisa had this new energy about her. She was more enthusiastic than usual, and she'd spent an unusual amount of time getting ready that night. Her hair was perfect. She'd picked out her favorite dress, and there was a spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in ages. I thought it was nice. I figured maybe she was excited for me to meet her colleagues and finally let me into her work life. We walked in, and from the start, something felt wrong. She kept glancing around the room, barely she was busy introducing me to anyone and everyone before darting off to the next person. I almost had to jog to keep up with her. Eventually, I found myself standing alone, holding 2 drinks and feeling like a forgotten part of the night. Then, out of nowhere, a guy I didn't recognize walked up to me, grinning like he already knew me. Later, I found out his name was Mark. He seemed a little too confident, maybe a few drinks ahead of the rest of us. He was talking more to himself than to anyone else, so I just nodded when he asked if I was Lisa's +1 tonight. His tone was casual but a bit too familiar. I was trying to figure out what was so funny about it. I said, "Yeah, we've been married a while." "Ah, married life," he laughed and shook his head. "I don't know if I've got that patience, but I've got someone at work too. It keeps things interesting." He smirked, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. "She's actually married, but that just adds to the thrill." Was this a flash of realization or a flicker of something too close for comfort? Either way, he didn't stop there. He kept going, leaning in closer and dropping his voice. There was a strange spark in his eyes. "I mean, she acts all innocent at work." He chuckled to himself, "But I'll tell you, after hours, there's a lot more to her than meets the eye. You'd never guess it from her buttoned-up act in the office, which drives me nuts." I forced myself to laugh, but my mind was racing. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence, or maybe not. The moment he said it, my mind was already spinning. I was listening closely to every word, but I kept my face neutral, watching him size him up, Mark. He was too deep in his drunken story to notice, caught up in his own smug satisfaction. I was already wondering if this was her, my wife Lisa. She's private about her work life, but this felt like more than just work secrecy. "Married woman, huh?" I said, keeping my tone casual. "Casual, doesn't that get complicated, Mark?" He laughed and shrugged, tipping his glass. "You'd think so, right? But nah, she's different. She keeps it easy. Smart, sly. You know, she keeps me guessing." He looked off, his face clouding with what almost looked like pride. "She even has this whole good girl image, but man, you should see her after a few drinks." The air felt tight, suffocating, the way he talked about her. It felt like he was revealing something dangerous, something meant to stay in the dark. I kept my expression cool, but my mind was racing, trying to grab hold of the sick. I could feel the tension in the room, so I decided to ask him about this mystery woman. He laughed again, louder this time. He seemed to think I was joking, but I could tell he was serious. He said she's got him wrapped around her finger. I don't think he even has a clue. She knows exactly what to say to throw him off her scent. She's good. He looked almost impressed, like he admired her ability to keep this double life going. I felt the world shift. My hands clenched around my glass as I forced myself to stay in the conversation and not give anything away. If Mark saw a hint of I was worried he'd sober up and start asking questions, so I stayed cool and nodding along like I was fascinated with his story. But in my mind, every casual line he dropped painted a clearer picture I couldn't look away from, no matter how hard I tried. There were also the private business trips and her sudden fascination with her appearance. Those late nights where she said she was working, all of it flashed through my head in brutal detail. I was drowning in this new reality, but I kept my face calm even as Mark turned back to the bar satisfied with his drunken confession. He'd already moved on chatting up someone else, leaving me there alone. His words were like a knife in my gut as I watched him blend back into the crowd, oblivious to the bombshell he'd just dropped on me. My hands felt numb, still gripping my drink, but I couldn't even taste it anymore. My mind was already racing with 1,000 questions. Did he know it was Lisa, or was this just a coincidence? Somehow, Lisa was in on it too. I watched her all night, and she was laughing with her colleagues. She had that same spark in her eye, like she was in on some big secret. She looked over and flashed me a casual smile, but it felt like it was hiding something. Each laugh, each glance. Glances had a different meaning now, and I couldn't stop analyzing every second of it. After a while, she drifted over to me, slipping her arm around my waist and asking if I was having fun. Her eyes searched mine, but I gave her nothing, just shrugged and played along. "Who's that guy, Mark?" I asked casually, tilting my. She looked over at him and gave a little laugh, rolling her eyes. "Oh, he's one of the marketing guys. He gets a bit loud after a few drinks, doesn't he?" She said it so effortlessly, so calmly, like he was no more than a random coworker. But I could see it right there. I caught a glimpse of her eyes, just for a second. They were guarded, but I let it go. I was playing it cool. I kept checking to see if he was missing. Sometimes he was, sometimes he wasn't, but it didn't matter because now, no matter where they were or what they were doing, I knew something had shifted. Everything wasn't what it seemed. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Every casual interaction between them twisted. Something more sinister was entering my mind, but the worst part was this unsettling feeling in my gut. I'd had this feeling for a long time, but I'd ignored it. That night on the way home, I was struggling to hold back. I wanted to confront her and get some answers, but I forced myself to wait. I needed proof. I couldn't risk her turning this on me and saying I was being paranoid, so I drove in silence with Lisa beside me, humming to herself like nothing was wrong. Like we were still us. When we got home, she gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and wandered off. I went to bed, but I stayed up, wide awake in the dark. My mind was racing, going over every detail of our life together, trying to find answers that felt like they'd been there all along. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's smug face, heard his words, and heard that mocking laugh. The way he spoke about his married woman kept going through my mind. By morning, I knew I couldn't just sit around and let this gnaw at me. I needed proof, something solid that would tell me if this was all in my head or if Lisa had actually crossed the line. The first thing I did was check her phone. I checked her phone while she was in the shower. We'd always been open with our devices. She knew my passcode and I knew hers, or at least I thought I did. But when I entered it, it was wrong 3 times. She'd changed it. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold dread settle over me. Lisa wasn't the type to change her password without a reason. I had a feeling there was more to it, and that was the first sign I couldn't ignore. I heard the water turn off, and I barely had time to set her phone down before she walked back into the room wrapped in a towel, humming like she hadn't a care in the world. She caught me looking at her phone, but instead of getting nervous, she just gave me this playful smirk, looking for something, as she teased, drying her hair. I forced to laugh, shrugging it off, just needed to check the time, must have forgotten your new code. Oh, did I change it? It was weird. Did it happen ages ago? She didn't even blink as she said it, but there was a glint in her eye that wasn't there before. She was acting like it was nothing, but I knew it was a problem. All day I watched her looking for any excuse to catch her in a lie. She acted normal, casual, almost too casual. Meanwhile, my mind was racing. I started thinking of all the things I'd ignored, like those nights when she'd come home later than usual. The frequent business trips she'd been assigned and that new confidence she seemed to have. I was putting the pieces of the puzzle together that evening she announced she'd be working late again. Another urgent project deadline. She barely looked at me as she said it. She was already gathering her things and throwing on her coat like she was in a rush. "Don't wait up," she said, flashing me a quick smile before heading out the door. She was gone in a flash. I grabbed my keys and followed her. I don't know what I expected, but I knew I couldn't just sit at home wondering. If she was meeting him, my heart was pounding as I followed her car through the city, staying out of sight. My mind was racing, wondering what I would do if I actually found them together. Eventually, she pulled up to a bar across town, not her office, not anywhere she'd usually go. She parked, looked around, and... She looked around as if she was checking for anyone watching, then slipped inside. I waited in my car, my pulse throbbing in my ears. I watched the door for about 5 minutes, and sure enough, Mark strolled up to the bar, glanced around, and slipped in behind her. I could feel my stomach twist as I watched it all unfold in front of me. All those doubts and hints I'd brushed off came crashing down on me at once. I sat there in the car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, thinking maybe I'd gotten it wrong, maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, I knew I couldn't just sit there waiting for them to come out together. I needed to see this for myself. With my heart pounding, I stepped out of the car, trying to steady my hands as I walked toward the bar. Inside the place was dimly lit and loud, with a lot of people unwinding from their day. I scanned the crowd, taking in each table and every corner until I finally saw them. They were tucked into a booth at the far end, barely visible in the low light. She was leaning toward him, smiling that same bright, lively smile she'd once saved. Mark was close to her, way too close. He was talking in a low voice, his hand on the back of the booth, just inches from her shoulder. Then, as if it were nothing, she reached out, put her hand on his, and laughed softly. My stomach dropped. There was no denying it. The way she looked at him like he was. In that moment, it was clear that she was completely absorbed in him. It was a look she hadn't given me in months. I felt my legs moving on their own, pulling me closer to their booth. Part of me wanted to yell and demand an explanation, but something held me back. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe it was the need to see how far they would go. I couldn't tell how deep her betrayal ran. I stopped just close enough to hear them without being noticed. "Can you stay a little longer tonight?" she was saying. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "I don't want to go home yet," he said, chuckling. He took her hand and laced his fingers through hers. It was like the most natural thing in the world. "In the world, I've got all night for you, babe." You know, they were so absorbed in each other that neither of them noticed me standing just a few feet away, frozen in place, watching as she looked at him with a mix of excitement and affection that twisted the knife even deeper. It was one thing to suspect it, to imagine she was with someone else, but seeing it right there in front of me was like watching my entire life fall apart in slow motion. After a few minutes, they got up laughing and headed toward the door, still hand in hand. I backed up, ducking behind a corner as they passed by her. Laughter echoed in my ears. She had no idea I was there. She had no idea her secret was out. I stayed. I watched them walk out together, as if they had no one else in the world to answer to. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I stood there in the bar, my mind racing. I felt cold and calculating, but also clear-headed. I'd expected to feel rage or heartbreak, but instead I felt calm and in control. Everything seemed to shift into focus, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. I stepped outside and watched from a distance as they walked down the sidewalk, unaware of me or anyone around them. She was holding his arm, laughing freely, her head leaning close to his shoulder. That image burned into my memory, solidifying the betrayal. I knew I had to confront her, but it couldn't be here, not in some random bar where she could brush it off, pretend it was nothing, or even turn the blame on me. This confrontation would be different. I needed to make sure I had all the facts. I followed them at a safe distance, watching as they strolled into a quiet neighborhood a few blocks away. It felt surreal, like I was watching a scene from someone else's life. I watched them stop in front of an apartment building and laugh as they fumbled for the keys. Then they slipped inside. I stayed outside, noting the address and apartment number they entered. I made a mental note of every detail. This wasn't just a random affair, it was premeditated. She had a separate life here. They went together like they were a couple. I stood there for a few minutes, letting the reality of it sink in. She hadn't just crossed a line, she'd gone way beyond it. She'd built an entirely new world for herself and left me in the dark. I wasn't going to be kept in the dark anymore. That night, I went home, cold and methodical. I gathered everything I needed, bank statements, phone records, and any other information I could find to build my case. I couldn't let her see any signs of this when she came home, so I cleared all traces and placed everything back exactly as it was. But my heart pounded with each small discovery, like charges from a hotel I'd never heard of. I'd heard of dinners she'd never mentioned and little unexplained withdrawals that now made a lot of sense when she finally returned home later that night. Her expression was the same calm, innocent look she usually had, like she'd had a late night at work. She greeted me with a tired smile, dropped her purse, and sat down. She poured herself a glass of wine, and there was no hint of guilt in her eyes. She perfected the act, and it was clear to me that she'd done it before. But I'd seen behind it now, and I knew the truth. I decided then that I wouldn't say a word. I wanted to see how long she'd keep up the charade and how many lies she'd tell me with that same straight face. I'd gather all the information I could and set my trap. I'd wait until she had nowhere left to hide. When I finally confronted her, she'd have no way out. The days that followed were excruciating. Every morning, I'd watch her go through her usual routine as if nothing had changed. She'd wake up, kiss me on the cheek, and ask about my day. She'd ask about my day's plans, spinning her own web of deceit. Each day, she dug herself in deeper, and I played along, acting as if I didn't know. I kept my tone casual and hid any trace of suspicion. The worst part was seeing how effortless her lies had become. She'd glance at her phone during dinner, subtly hiding the screen, or claim she was headed out with the girls when I knew exactly where she'd be. Every excuse she made for leaving the office late added another nail in the coffin. She was so brazen and comfortable that it was almost like she wanted to get caught. One evening, as she was getting ready to meet her team for drinks, I decided to test her. She was in front of the mirror, carefully applying her makeup. Her eyes were focused, her expression steady. It was as if tonight was just another routine part of her life. "You're going out again?" I asked, leaning against the door frame. "Didn't you just have a team meeting yesterday?" Second, I saw it, a flicker in her eyes and a tiny stumble in her composure. She recovered fast, though, giving me a playful smile as she zipped up her dress. "Oh, you know how they are," she said with a casual wave. "It's all about team bonding these days. It's mandatory fun." She laughed, and for a moment, I almost believed her. I let myself get swept up in her little story, but I knew better. "Don't stay out too late," I said, watching her closely. "I thought maybe we could plan something together tomorrow night." She looked back at me in the mirror, her expression softening as if she was considering it. "I'll try not to, but it might be." It was late, and she was lying again. Smooth as silk, she left soon after her perfume lingered in the hallway. I felt the anger simmering, controlled but fierce. I had been collecting all her lies and stories, lining them up in my mind like dominoes. I could see every way she had manipulated me and twisted my trust into her own advantage, and I knew exactly where she was going tonight. Back to that apartment with Mark, where she thought she was safe once she left. I grabbed my keys and followed her again. I didn't just want proof anymore. I wanted to see her face when she realized it was over. That I had been watching her unravel her own life. I didn't wait outside this time. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to be able to prove it. I parked around the corner, walked up to the building, and waited until I saw the light in that familiar window flick on. I pulled out my phone camera and started documenting everything: the address, the time, the names. On the buzzers, everything that would paint the truth in full color. Then I did something that made my pulse race. I pressed record and walked up the stairs. When I reached their door, I stood there listening to her laughter from inside. It was carefree and full of life. Then I knocked, and the knock echoed down the hallway. It was loud. And then, finally, inside the room, the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a tense silence. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for footsteps to shuffle behind the door, and then it swung open. Lisa's face went pale the instant she saw me, her mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. Behind her, Mark was frozen, his expression quickly shifting. From surprise to guilty unease, he looked between us, already piecing together what was happening. He stayed quiet, almost as if he hoped he could blend into the background and disappear from mind. "I'm sorry to barge in like this," I said, my voice steady but with a hint of anger simmering just below the surface. Lisa stammered, barely able to get out a coherent word. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, I just thought I'd stop by since you're always working so late." Their place, their hideaway, and every inch of it felt like another betrayal. Mark tried to gather himself, clearing his throat. "Listen, man, I didn't know you were there. I didn't know I was there. Did you just not care?" He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked to Lisa, almost pleadingly, as if she could somehow fix this mess, but Lisa was still staring at me, her face a mixture of shock and panic. "This is where you've been working late, huh?" I said, looking back at her. My voice shook a little despite my best efforts to stay calm. This is why you've been sneaking around, lying to my face, making up all those excuses. Lisa blinked rapidly like she was trying to find a way out, but her silence spoke louder than any excuse she could have come up with. Finally, she managed to say, "I can explain." "Oh, I'd love to hear it." I crossed my arms, watching her. I was waiting for her to come up with some kind of excuse, but she didn't have one. She took a shaky breath and reached out toward me, but I stepped back. She let her hand drop. "It's just things," she said, her voice trembling. "They haven't been the same between us. You felt distant, so you decided to start sneaking around behind my back instead of talking to me. This is how you fix things." She looked down, unable to meet my eyes, but I wasn't done. I turned to Mark, who was standing there fidgeting. He was still trying to make himself small. "You," I said, my voice sharper. "You knew she was married. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you just didn't care. Did you?" He swallowed, glancing between us. "Look, I didn't save it," I snapped. "You're both lying and selfish. You deserve each other." I turned back to Lisa, who was blinking back tears. Now her face was full of regret, but I wasn't buying it. Not after all the lies and all the nights I'd sat at home wondering where she was and all the trust she'd shattered without a second thought. "I want you to pack your things." My voice was cold and final. "I want you out of our home by tomorrow. I'm done." The air was heavy and absolute. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They were stunned by the reality of what they'd lost because of their selfishness. As I turned to leave, I felt a strange, liberating calm settle over me. The truth was out, and I was finally free of her lies. I walked out of that apartment without looking back, feeling a strange mix of devastation and relief. The truth was brutal, but at least it was out in the open for everyone to see. When I got in the car, I realized that for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel that constant, nagging suspicion, or the lies, doubts, and nights lying awake wondering where she was. They were over. With that came a strange, hollow calm. When I got home, the silence was overwhelming. Our house, once filled with shared memories and quiet routines, now felt empty. It felt like she'd already vanished from it. Every little thing I looked at, the framed photos, the clothes in the closet, the mug she'd left on the counter was tainted by her betrayal. I walked around the room to room, feeling like a stranger in my own life. Each item felt like a reminder of what I thought we had, the love I believed was real. I stayed up all night, my mind replaying everything. This time it was different. I wasn't searching for answers. I was coming to terms with the truth. I'd ignored the small cracks I'd noticed over the years. I'd made excuses for her behavior. It all made sense now. She'd been living a double life right in front of me, taking advantage of my trust. I'd let her get away with it. But in the morning, I finally felt the anger start to rise. It was a slow-burning fire that brought back a sense of control. I gathered all her things into boxes. Anything that felt like her, anything that reminded me of her presence in the house. I worked silently, methodically boxing up every trace of her as if I were clearing out a toxic presence. I was done. I set the boxes by the door with a note on top, "Pick up your things. We're finished." A few hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. She wanted to talk to me. She said she had something to explain. I ignored it. Then another message followed, and another. They shifted from apologetic to pleading. She said she'd made a mistake. She could change it. We could work this out. But every word, it just made me angrier. It reinforced the idea that she thought she could control the narrative and manipulate me one more time. Around noon, she showed up at the door, eyes red, her face pale. She started talking before she even stepped inside, but I held up a hand, stopping her. I said, "Your things are there. Take them and go. Please just listen to me." She whispered, her voice cracking. "It was a mistake. I don't even know what I was thinking. I love you. You don't get to say that I interrupted." My voice is steady but cold. "Is that what you call sneaking around, lying to my face, hiding some second life? If you loved me, you'd have been honest. Instead, you threw everything we built away for him. She opened her mouth, but for once, she seemed to have nothing to say. There was a silence between us. It was heavy and undeniable. In that silence, I felt the last remnants of whatever I'd once felt for. She'd made her choice, and now I was making mine. "Take your things and leave," I said again, more firmly this time. "We're done with that." I turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind me. I didn't wait to watch her go. The door was closed, and so was that chapter of my life. I stood by the door listening to her footsteps retreat down the driveway. Finally, I heard the faint sound of her car starting as she drove away. I felt a strange weight lift, replaced by a raw open wound for so long. I've been living in her shadow, her secrets, her lies. Now there was just silence. It was both liberating and painfully empty. Over the next few days, I kept my phone on silent, watching her messages pile up without replying. Some were long and desperate. Others were angry and accused me of giving up too easily. They said it was my fault. One night, she even showed up outside the house. The doorbell rang at midnight. I watched from the window as she paced, her face a mix of anger and regret. She called my name softly, hoping I'd let her in, but I stayed hidden and invisible, refusing to give her the satisfaction of even a glance. Eventually, she gave up and drove away. I thought the worst was over, but then I started hearing from friends. It was mutual acquaintances asking what was going on between us. They'd heard things, apparently from Lisa. She was spinning her version of the story before I even had a chance to breathe, according to her. She said I'd been a distant husband who didn't care about her. She painted herself as the victim, cornered into the affair because I'd left her feeling unloved. She said she had no other choice. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. Not only had she betrayed me, but now she was trying to rewrite history. She was manipulating our friends with half-truths. She was protecting herself by lying and making up stories. It was like she couldn't face the truth without dragging my name down with her. One night, my friend Jake called. He was really nervous. He said, "I didn't want to bring this up, but Lisa's been saying that you and she have problems." I realized that she was trying to turn the situation around and blame me for things that weren't my fault. Jake said, "I knew it didn't sound like you, but she's pretty convincing. Maybe it was a mutual misunderstanding, or she was just reacting to how things went down." The manipulation was pretty deep. Not only had she lied to me, but now she was lying about me trying to take down my character to justify her own actions. Instead of getting angry, I felt a determination to stand my ground. If she wanted to rewrite our history, she'd have to do it alone. I told Jake my voice was steady, and people who know me will see through it. I'll see through it, and the ones who don't will have to face the consequences. I'm done caring. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I distanced myself from those who bought into her lies. Those who mattered saw the truth in time. I took her number off my phone, packed away what little was left of hers, and started focusing on my own. Life is good again, friends. My work, my future, but the biggest step came a week later when I went to see a lawyer. I explained everything, her lies, her betrayal, the way she dragged my name through the mud. He listened quietly, nodding before asking if I was ready to let her go completely. I said yes, more certain than ever that it's over. As I walked out of his office, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a strange, hopeful feeling. The chapter was closing, and I was finally free. I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a strange, hopeful peace. The chapter was closing, and I was finally free. A few days after meeting with the lawyer, I filed for divorce. I knew it would hit Lisa hard. She hadn't stopped calling or texting, alternating between apologies, pleas, and accusations. Each message seemed more desperate than the last. The last one was like she was slowly realizing the reality of what she'd done, and filing for divorce meant she couldn't ignore it any longer. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The news spread fast. Within days, I started getting messages from family members, both mine and hers. Lisa's sister, Rachel, reached out first. She's always been a bit of a wild card, but she was one of the few people I could trust to be straight with me. Her message read, "I just heard about everything. I don't know what Lisa is telling you, but I had no idea she was seeing someone else. I'm so sorry. Honestly, you didn't deserve this." I wasn't expecting this. I thought she'd defend her sister or even lecture me about saving the marriage. But her words came out surprisingly blunt. It was almost as if she'd been waiting to tell me what she thought. I replied briefly but honestly. Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it. She's been spinning some stories. I've heard a few things, so it's been a bit of a rough patch. Rachel responded almost instantly. I'm sure she is. She's always had a way of twisting things to suit her. Just know that some of us see through it. You don't owe her anything, not after what she did. It was strange reading her words, feeling a sense of validation from someone on Lisa's side of the family said something that confirmed what I'd been thinking all along. Lisa's behavior wasn't an isolated act. I'd ignored or overlooked this side of her, thinking it was just her charm or ambition. Over the following weeks, Lisa's desperation only grew. I blocked her number. After she left a dozen voicemails in a single night, each one more frantic than the last, she apologized, then raged at me, accused me of giving up too easily, and claimed she could change if I just gave her one more chance. But it was too late. I was already at the point of no return, and nothing she said could undo the damage. But Lisa wasn't done yet. One evening, I returned home to find her waiting for me on my front porch. I almost turned back, but I couldn't keep running forever. I took a deep breath and approached her. As soon as she saw me, she rushed over, her face a mix of anger and desperation. Are you doing this? She demanded, her voice trembling. We can fix this. I can fix this. You're just throwing everything away over one mistake. One mistake is an accident, I replied, my voice cold and steady. Lisa, what you did was a choice. A series of choices. You lied to me. You hid things. You built an. She'd spent her whole life behind my back, and now that she was facing the consequences, she was trying to blame me. She looked taken aback, like she hadn't expected me to be so blunt. But I'd held my silence long enough, and I was done letting her control the narrative. Why couldn't she just talk to me? I asked. Question. Slipping out, carrying the hurt I'd buried beneath the anger if you were unhappy. Why not tell me instead of tearing us apart like this? She opened her mouth, struggling for words, her face softening with something that almost looked like remorse. I don't know, she whispered. Looking away, I didn't want to lose you. Well, you did. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know I did. I didn't mean to make you feel this way. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lose you. I know I did. I didn't mean to make you feel this way. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lose you. I know I did. I didn't mean to make you feel this way. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lose you. I know I did. I didn't mean to make you feel this way. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lose you. I know I did. I didn't mean to make you feel this way. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to lose you. I know after a few moments, her footsteps receded into the night. I felt like I was standing on solid ground again. Her chapter in my life was finally closing, and the weight of it was finally lifting. I was free, truly free, after that last encounter. I didn't expect to hear from Lisa again. I'd set my boundaries and made my stance clear, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had my life back. The days started to feel normal again, quiet but stable. I found new routines and even started seeing friends more. I was rebuilding parts of my life I hadn't realized I'd let slip away. Then one evening, just as I was settling in with a book, there was a knock on my door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that Lisa had come back, ignoring every word I'd said. I sighed, bracing myself for yet another confrontation, but when I opened the door, I was met with an entirely different face. I was getting comfortable with a book when there was a knock on my door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was that Lisa had come back, ignoring every word I'd said. I sighed, bracing myself for yet another confrontation. But when I opened the door, I was met with an entirely different face. It was Mark. I stood there for a few seconds, stunned. He looked rough, like I felt. His hair was unkempt, and he had shadows under his eyes. He shifted nervously on my porch, clearly unsure how to start. I could feel the anger welling up immediately. The last person I wanted to see, the one person who had managed to destroy everything, was now standing on my doorstep as if he had something to say. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice low and controlled. He took a deep breath, his eyes avoiding mine. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see right now, and I get that, but I needed to come here." He paused, glancing down at his hands. "I just wanted to tell you I didn't know you. I didn't know who you were until that night. If I'd known, I wouldn't have." "Save it," I interrupted, shaking my head. "You both knew exactly what you were doing. So why are you here now?" Mark winced. He looked almost guilty and ran a hand through his hair, then met my gaze. "I owe you an apology. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I messed up." "Lisa," he trailed off, as if he couldn't finish the thought. "You seemed like you were checked out and didn't care." She made it sound like the marriage was over and that she was just waiting for the right time to end things. I scoffed, crossing my arms. "So, you were just waiting for your chance?" "No, that's not an excuse," he said quickly, looking down. "I just guess. I wanted you to know the whole story. She told me she was going to leave you because you were practically out of her life already." I felt a void. I know I felt a mix of emotions, anger, bitterness, even a twisted sort of relief. So she'd lied to him too. She created her own little fantasy world where everyone was disposable. But I wasn't about to let you off the hook that easily. "Whether she lied to you or not doesn't change what you did," I said sharply. "You still went along with it. You saw a married woman and instead of walking away, you jumped in without a second thought. That's on you. I was in a fantasy world where everyone was disposable, but I wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. Whether she lied to you or not doesn't change what you did," I said. "You still went along with it. You saw a married woman and instead of walking away, you jumped in without a second thought. That's on you." "You know," he nodded, taking the rebuke without argument. "I know, and I'll live with that." It was the same wreckage. Lisa had created each of us, leaving us with a different cut from the same blade. I wanted to hate him and push him off my porch and out of my life for good, but looking at him, I saw something that struck me. He was just another fool who'd been caught in her web, another pawn she'd used to get what she wanted. She wanted him to be guilty, yes, but he was also broken, and that in some strange way made me feel a little less alone. "Fine," I said, stepping back. "You've said your piece, now leave and let both of us move on." He nodded slowly, looking as if a weight had lifted from his shoulders. "Thanks, and I really am sorry for all of." I closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. For the first time, I realized that Lisa hadn't just betrayed me. She'd deceived everyone in her life, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. I was finally free of her games and somehow knew I wasn't the only one I'd been misled and manipulated. Mark left some of the sting behind that night, and I knew I'd probably never see him again. I was finally ready to let go of the anger and start rebuilding a life that was fully my own. After Mark's visit, something shifted in me. I felt a strange sense of closure. The betrayal, the lies, the anger, it had reached its peak and was starting to dissolve, leaving something clearer, something simpler behind. I was done with her lies, done with the questions, done with looking back. I could finally start looking forward. Over the next few weeks, I started rebuilding my life, which had nothing to do with Lisa. I reached out to friends I hadn't seen in months or even years. I drifted away from them while trying to keep up with her hectic, chaotic lifestyle. I poured energy into my work, picked up old hobbies that had gathered dust, and spent more time with family. I even started going to the gym again, pushing myself in ways that reminded me of who I was before she came into my life and turned it upside down. At first, there were small unexpected pangs where I'd reach for my phone almost instinctively to tell her something or glance at the empty side of I'd lie in bed and feel a rush of loneliness, but over time, that feeling started to fade. Each day, I felt myself growing stronger and more confident, slowly regaining the person I'd been before her deceit had clouded everything. Then, one afternoon, as I was sorting through some old boxes in the attic, I found a photo album from our early days together. There we were, grinning at each other, hands locked, faces full of excitement and promise. I stared at those photos for a long time, studying the details. I realized that I didn't recognize those people anymore. The man in those photos was naive, too trusting, blindly. He was an optimistic guy who had no idea what was coming. He had no way of knowing that the person he loved would betray him so completely. But there was no anger, no regret. Looking back, I felt a quiet acceptance and a sad understanding that sometimes people change and relationships decay, even when you give them everything you have. Instead of throwing the album away, I packed it back into the box and pushed it aside. I realized that it didn't hurt anymore. It was just a story. I'd lived it, learned from it, and could finally leave it behind. That night, I sat down and wrote out everything I'd been through. I wrote down every painful truth and I learned a valuable lesson. I wanted to write something to look back on as a reminder of how far I'd come and of what I would never settle for again. As I wrote, I felt a strange sense of pride. I'd been through a lot, but I'd come out the other side stronger, clearer, and finally truly free. In the weeks that followed, people noticed the change. Friends commented on it. I seemed to have found a new sense of lightness and ease. It was as if a weight had been lifted. I smiled and nodded, letting them in on the truth I'd found. I was finally my own person again, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to start fresh. I was ready to open myself up to new experiences and new people, maybe even new love. Months passed, and I began to put the pieces of my life back together. My life started getting back on track. Every day felt easier and more free, as if I'd finally shed a weight I didn't even know I was carrying. I no longer thought about Lisa or the betrayal. They were relics of a past life, locked away in memories that no longer held power over me. One afternoon while out grabbing coffee, I ran into an old friend from college, Emma. We hadn't seen each other in years, but talking to her felt natural. It was as if no time had passed at all. She'd heard about the divorce through mutual friends. For a moment, I felt a familiar awkwardness, a lingering reminder of everything I'd been through. But Emma had a way of making it easy. She focused on where I was now and the future, rather than the past. By the time after we finished our coffee, I realized I was genuinely enjoying myself, laughing in a way I hadn't in what felt like ages. That day turned into a series of easy, casual meetups. We'd go on walks, grab dinner, talk about life, hopes, and things we wanted out of the future. There was no rush or pressure, it was just two people reconnecting, both changed by life in different ways. One evening, as we sat on a park bench watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emma turned to me with a gentle smile on her face. "You seem different," she said. Her voice was soft and happier. I thought about it for a moment, letting her words sink in. She was right. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by memories of betrayal or anger. I'd found myself again. Someone I hadn't been in a long time. It had been years since I'd been in this situation with someone I liked. I smiled back, feeling a warmth that I hadn't expected to feel again. I replied, feeling the truth in my words, that I am. I finally let go and I'm ready for whatever's next. Emma reached out and took my hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We sat there silently, just two people sharing a moment, unburdened by the past and open to the future. In that quiet stillness, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a sense of hope, of possibility, of new beginnings. I had no idea where things would go with Emma or even if it would turn into something more, but I knew one thing for sure, I was no longer defined by my past. I was free, ready to step forward and embrace whatever came next.